It was late in the afternoon, the sky slowly turning a soft orange as the sun lowered behind the buildings. The air was calm, the streets were not too busy, and a soft breeze moved through the trees. A man was driving home after a long day at work. He had taken off his jacket, loosened his tie, and was finally starting to relax. The city streets were familiar, the turns automatic. He liked this time of day, when the noise of the world seemed to soften and all that was left was the sound of tires against the road and the faint hum of the engine. He had been working hard for weeks on a case that kept him in long meetings and quiet rooms with no windows. Now finally, he was looking forward to getting home, cooking something simple, and sitting on the couch without thinking about anything serious. He didn't notice the patrol car behind him at first. It was a few cars back, slowly catching up. But when the flashing red and blue lights suddenly filled the mirror, his calm moment ended. He gently pulled the car toward the curb. The flashing lights reflected off nearby windows. A few people looked up from the sidewalk. The sound of the siren was short, just enough to make sure he didn't miss it. He parked carefully, took a slow breath, and rested both hands on the steering wheel where they were easy to see. This was not his first time being stopped for no clear reason. He had learned long ago that staying calm was the best thing to do. Two police officers stepped out of the patrol car. Their movements were sharp, quick, and stiff. One of them held a flashlight even though the sun was still out. The other rested his hand close to his belt. They walked with the kind of posture that didn't say routine check but rather trouble. The man watched them in the mirror, his expression steady. The first officer came up to the driver's window and knocked on it with the tip of the flashlight, not gently. The man rolled down the window. "License and registration," the officer said. His tone was cold and suspicious. "Of course," the man replied. His voice was calm, steady, polite. He handed over his driver's license and registration without hesitation. The second officer walked around to the passenger side, shining his flashlight into the car as if searching for something dangerous. "Where are you headed?" the first officer asked, narrowing his eyes. "Home," the man answered. The officer stared at him a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked at the license. His expression didn't change. He didn't even take the time to really read what was in his hand. "What are you doing around here?" the officer asked again. The man almost smiled, not out of amusement but because he had heard this kind of question too many times before. "I live around here," he said simply. The second officer came closer now. "Step out of the car," he ordered. There was no clear reason for this, but the man didn't argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, opened the door, and stepped out. The officers immediately took a small step back as if ready for something to happen, though he had done nothing wrong. "Put your hands where I can see them," the first officer said, though the man's hands were already at his sides. He lifted them a little higher, showing he had nothing to hide. He stayed calm. His heartbeat was steady, not from fear but from a quiet awareness. He knew exactly what was happening. The first officer started circling him, eyeing him from head to toe. The second officer stood a little behind, hands still resting near his belt. Their faces showed the same thing he had seen too many times before: judgment without reason. They weren't looking at his ID. They weren't asking about any actual violation. They had already made their assumptions the moment they saw him behind the wheel. "Why are you driving this car?" one of them asked, looking at the clean black sedan like it didn't fit the person standing in front of them. "Because it's mine," the man answered simply. The officer didn't like that answer. His lips tightened. He looked down at the license again, but it was clear he still wasn't really processing what was written on it. It wasn't about the license. "Do you have any weapons on you?" the second officer asked, stepping closer now. "No," the man said. "Any drugs in the vehicle?" "No." "You mind if we take a look?" The man knew he had the right to say no, but he also knew how quickly situations like this could turn ugly if not handled with care. "Go ahead," he said evenly. While one officer walked toward the car, the other stayed close to him, watching him like a threat. The man didn't flinch. He had faced much more dangerous situations in his life, but what made this one sting was how ordinary it was. How it came not from criminals, but from people wearing badges. The second officer started searching the front of the car, opening the glove box, looking into the back seat, even checking under the seats. The man stood still on the side of the road, the setting sun now lower in the sky. A couple of people walking their dogs slowed down to watch. A few cars passed slowly, drivers glancing curiously. The first officer moved closer again. "What do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone filled with doubt. "I work in law enforcement," the man replied softly. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing it. "Sure you do," he muttered. The man didn't respond. He just kept looking straight ahead, calm, patient. Years of training had taught him how to control his face, how to let others reveal themselves before he said a single extra word. The officer stepped even closer. "We're going to do a quick search," he said. "For everyone's safety." The man nodded once. He already knew what was coming. The officer ordered him to turn around and place his hands on the roof of the car. The man did as he was told. He could feel the cold metal of the car under his palms. The officer began patting down his jacket, moving slowly down his arms. From the corner of his eye, the man noticed an older couple stop on the sidewalk to watch. A teenage boy pulled out his phone but quickly put it down, unsure if filming would make things worse. People weren't shocked to see a stop like this. That was the sad part. It was normal to them. The officer searched down to his pockets, not saying much. His tone was still sharp, but there was something else in it now. The edge of someone trying to prove something. The man stood quietly. He didn't resist, didn't react. He had no reason to. As the second officer continued to search the car, the first one returned to his license, flipping it over like he might have missed something. But instead of reading, he shoved it into his pocket and kept searching. "Where did you say you worked?" the officer asked again. "I didn't say where," the man corrected calmly. "I said I work in law enforcement." The officer narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, right." The way he said it wasn't just disbelief. It carried the kind of tone people use when they've already decided what kind of person you are. The man could feel it, but he didn't let it break his calm. The second officer finally stepped back from the car, shaking his head. "Nothing in the vehicle," he said to his partner. The first officer didn't seem satisfied. "That doesn't mean anything," he muttered. "Pat him down again." This time the officer searched a little more carefully, his hands brushing against the inside of the man's jacket. That's when his fingers stopped. He felt something solid inside, something that didn't belong to a wallet or keys, something official. The officer's hand froze for a second. Then he slowly reached inside the jacket pocket and pulled it out. It was a badge. The officer stared at it. His face shifted from hard and cold to confused. He turned it over in his hand, his eyes narrowing as he read the words carefully this time. The second officer stepped closer, frowning. "What's that?" The first officer didn't answer immediately. He just kept staring. The man turned his head slightly. "You might want to read it carefully," he said in the same calm voice he'd used from the start. The air around them suddenly felt heavier. The people on the sidewalk leaned a little closer. Something in the officer's posture changed. The kind of change that happens when someone realizes they've made a mistake they can't take back easily. The second officer took the badge from his partner's hand and read it too. His mouth opened a little, but no words came out. The man didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just stood there, steady and patient. He had given them every chance to handle things the right way. They hadn't taken it. The sun had almost set now, the light turning golden and soft. But the silence between the three men was sharp and heavy. The officer's hands lowered slightly. The power in the situation was no longer one-sided, and they all knew it, even before a single word of explanation was given. A car passing by honked lightly, not in support or anger, just acknowledging the strange stillness on the street. A neighbor from across the road leaned against a fence, watching the scene unfold. The man didn't move. He didn't need to. In that moment, the officers were no longer just officers. They were two people realizing how wrong their assumptions had been. And that was only the beginning of what was to come. The silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. The two officers stood frozen, still staring at the badge in their hands. It was almost as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. A few seconds ago, they had been full of power and confidence. Now both of them seemed unsure, their expressions shifting from control to confusion. The man stood calmly beside his car, hands still resting on the roof. He didn't rush to speak, didn't try to explain anything. He let the silence work. He knew from experience that sometimes silence said more than words ever could. The first officer finally cleared his throat, trying to act like everything was still under control. What is this supposed to mean?" he asked, but his voice wasn't as strong as before. The man tilted his head slightly. "It's exactly what it looks like," he said. The second officer stepped a little closer, holding the badge carefully as if it might suddenly disappear. He turned it over, reading each word again, this time slower. His face lost the sharp edge it had when he first approached the car. His partner gave a quick, nervous glance at him, looking for some kind of signal, but found none. A few people on the sidewalk were still watching. Someone whispered something to another person. A woman across the street quietly pulled out her phone. She wasn't making noise. She was just filming, the way people do when they sense something important is happening. The first officer finally handed the badge back. His hand wasn't as steady now. "Look," he said, "we were just doing our job." The man took the badge back and slipped it carefully inside his jacket. He didn't look angry. His face remained calm, but there was something firm in the way he moved. A quiet strength that didn't need to be shouted to be felt. "Your job," the man replied slowly, "should have started with reading what was in your hand the first time." The officer opened his mouth but didn't find a good answer. The second officer tried to speak up. "We didn't know who you were." You didn't ask," the man interrupted softly. He didn't raise his voice, but the words landed like a weight. Both officers exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Their confidence from just minutes ago had faded, replaced with a tight, nervous energy. They weren't sure how to fix what had already happened. The second officer tried to regain a bit of control. "Sir, we still have procedures we have to follow," he said, his tone more careful now. "Then follow them properly," the man answered. "Not the way you started." The second officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. The first officer avoided eye contact, pretending to adjust something on his belt. It was obvious they were scrambling for a way to keep some dignity, but the balance of power had already changed. The man glanced toward the small crowd that had grown on the sidewalk. He could feel their quiet stares. They had watched every moment of the stop, the way he was spoken to, the way he was searched, the way they had assumed things about him without any real reason. And now, those same people were watching the officers fumble in the sudden silence. The first officer straightened his shoulders and tried to speak in a more official tone. "Sir, can we see some additional identification to confirm everything?" The man calmly reached into his inside jacket pocket, pulled out a second piece of identification and handed it over. This time, the officer actually looked at it carefully. He read the name, the title, and the federal seal. His lips tightened as he handed it back, slower than before. "All right," he said quietly, almost mumbling. The man slipped the ID back into his pocket. "All right," he repeated softly. But his tone was different. His all right wasn't a sign of agreement. It was the kind of quiet word that made someone realize they'd gone too far. The second officer took a step back. "Look, we didn't mean to disrespect you," he said quickly. "It's just, we have to be careful." "Being careful is one thing," the man said, "but what you did wasn't careful. It was careless," and the second officer had no answer. He looked down at his boots, avoiding the man's eyes. The first officer still tried to keep a straight face, but it was clear his confidence was gone. The crowd's quiet murmurs made it worse. He could feel their judgment now, the same way he had judged someone else a few minutes earlier. "You pulled me over," the man continued slowly, "without any clear reason. You didn't check the license properly. You made assumptions before you asked questions. That's not being careful. That's not doing your job." The second officer's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The first one shifted his feet, glanced at the crowd, then back at the man. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. The man took a deep breath, not out of frustration, but to steady the air between them. He knew moments like this could turn tense again if not handled correctly. He had no interest in making a scene. He wanted them to understand the weight of what they had done. "Sir," the second officer finally said in a smaller voice, we wanted to make sure everything was safe." "I was never a threat to you," the man said softly but firmly. "But you treated me like one from the second you stepped out of that car." The second officer's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He knew it was true. He didn't need to be told twice. The man stepped slightly away from his car, not in a threatening way, but with the calm assurance of someone who was fully aware of his rights. His movements were controlled, deliberate. The first officer suddenly spoke up again, his voice almost desperate to gain some ground back. "We're just doing our job. If you're really who you say you are, then I'm sure you understand that." "I do understand what doing your job looks like," the man replied. "And this isn't it." That single sentence left the officer quiet again. The second officer glanced down at the man's car, then back at his partner. "Maybe we should call the supervisor," he whispered. The first officer hesitated, clearly not wanting to bring anyone else into this, but it was too late. Their mistake was already too visible. People were still watching. The man said nothing. He just crossed his arms lightly, waiting. The first officer stepped away and spoke into his radio, his voice low but tense. The second officer stayed behind, shifting uncomfortably. The man could almost feel his nerves. He had seen this exact reaction before. Not here, but in other situations where someone suddenly realized they were no longer in control. A light wind blew through the street, rustling the leaves in the nearby trees. The siren lights were still flashing softly, painting everything in red and blue. It was strange how the world could feel both loud and quiet at the same time. The second officer finally looked at him again. His voice was softer now, almost uncertain. "You're not going to file a complaint or anything, are you?" The man didn't answer right away. He let the question hang there. The officer's shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight of his own actions was pressing down on him. "You should be less worried about me filing a complaint," the man said finally, "and more worried about how you treat people who can't flash a badge when you're wrong." That sentence hit harder than anything else he had said so far. The second officer lowered his gaze again. He had no defense. Minutes passed slowly. The crowd stayed quiet and curious. A few more people joined, drawn by the flashing lights and the tension they could almost feel in the air. The first officer walked back. His expression gave everything away. Their supervisor was on the way. "He's coming," he said shortly. The man nodded once. He wasn't surprised. This was exactly what should happen next. The two officers now stood side by side, no longer giving orders, no longer asking questions. They avoided looking directly at him, avoided looking at the crowd too. Their earlier confidence had vanished. What remained was discomfort. The man stayed calm, hands in his pockets, posture straight. He wasn't trying to humiliate them. He wasn't trying to make them afraid. But he wasn't going to let this moment pass like nothing happened either. He had seen too many people experience the same treatment without any power to fight back. The second officer suddenly whispered to his partner, "This is bad." The first officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. It was written all over his face. The man turned his eyes toward the sunset for a moment. The sky was fading from gold to a soft pink. It was strange how the world could look so peaceful, while something so tense unfolded on the ground below it. When he looked back at the officers, he could see they were both uneasy, their posture not as tall as when they first stepped out of the patrol car. Their hands no longer rested near their belts. Their tone had changed. Their faces had changed. The man didn't rush them. He didn't need to. The weight of their own actions was doing the work. He simply waited for the supervisor to arrive, knowing that from this point on, things would not go the way they expected. The flashing lights continued to reflect off the car windows. The street stayed quiet and the crowd stood still. The two officers who had once carried themselves with such authority were now just two nervous men, waiting for the moment when someone with more power than them would ask the questions they didn't want to answer. And the man who had remained calm from the very beginning didn't need to say a single word more to make that clear. This wasn't just another traffic stop anymore. It had become something much bigger. The sound of another engine slowly filled the street. A dark-colored SUV with tinted windows rolled up behind the patrol car. The two officers straightened their backs quickly when they saw it, their faces tightening. They both knew what it meant. Their supervisor had arrived. The flashing red and blue lights from their car bounced off the shiny paint of the new vehicle. The door opened and a man in a clean uniform stepped out. His movements were calm, but there was something about the way he walked that made it clear he was in charge. The two officers immediately shifted their stance, almost like students caught doing something wrong. They didn't speak first. They just waited. The supervisor took a slow look around. He noticed the crowd on the sidewalk, the patrol car still running, the man standing calmly beside his own vehicle, and the uncomfortable expressions on his officers' faces. He didn't need anyone to tell him that something wasn't right. He could feel it. "What's going on here?" he asked in a steady voice. The first officer cleared his throat. We made a traffic stop," he said. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. For what? The officer hesitated, just long enough for the silence to grow awkward. Suspicious activity, he finally said. The supervisor didn't look convinced. He turned his gaze to the man standing by the car. Unlike the officers, the man didn't fidget or avoid eye contact. He stood with quiet confidence, hands in his pockets, watching everything unfold like someone who had been through this before. The supervisor walked closer to him. "Sir," he said politely, "can you tell me what happened?" The man spoke in a calm, even tone. "They pulled me over. No reason was given. They demanded I get out of the car. They searched me and my vehicle without explanation. They didn't check my identification properly. Then they found my badge." The word badge hung in the air like a weight. The supervisor blinked once, then turned slowly to his officers. "Badge?" he repeated. The second officer shifted nervously. "Yeah, we didn't know," he said quietly. The supervisor's jaw tightened. He turned back to the man. "May I see it?" The man reached into his jacket and handed it over without hesitation. The supervisor held it carefully, read it, and let out a slow breath. His face changed immediately. His tone softened, not out of pity but out of respect. He handed the badge back with both hands, something neither of the officers had done. "Sir, I apologize," he said, his voice lower now. "This should not have happened." The man didn't react right away. He took his badge back and slipped it inside his jacket again. The supervisor didn't try to justify anything. He knew exactly what kind of mistake his officers had made. Behind them, a couple of people from the crowd whispered to each other. One person said, "He's FBI," loud enough for a few others to hear. A ripple of murmurs spread down the sidewalk. More phones were pointed in their direction now. This was no longer just a traffic stop. The supervisor faced his officers again. "Did you verify his ID?" he asked sharply. The first officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Not at first," he admitted. The supervisor stared at him. "Why not?" There was no good answer, and everyone knew it. The silence stretched longer and longer, making the two officers look smaller by the second. The man didn't step in. He didn't need to defend himself. He let the truth speak for itself. The supervisor finally turned back to him. "I understand if you want to file a report," he said. "I'll cooperate fully. This incident will be reviewed immediately." The man nodded slightly. "I'll make sure it is," he said in a quiet but steady voice. The first officer rubbed the back of his neck. The second one avoided looking up. They both knew the situation was completely out of their hands now. A few minutes earlier, they were the ones asking the questions. Now they were the ones being questioned. The supervisor walked a few steps away and spoke into his radio, giving a brief report about what happened. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it, the sound of someone already planning what disciplinary steps would follow. Meanwhile, the man leaned back against his car, taking in the cool night air. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. But deep inside, he felt something shift. This wasn't just about him. He knew if he hadn't been who he was, this situation could have ended very differently. The supervisor returned and faced him again. "I can assure you this won't be ignored," he said carefully. "These two will be held accountable." The man looked at the two officers. They couldn't meet his eyes. Their faces were pale, their hands stiff at their sides. A few drops of sweat shone on the first officer's forehead, even though the air had cooled down. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's life," the man said slowly. "But I do expect people in your position to do their jobs right. Respect is not something you give based on how someone looks. It should be automatic." His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The crowd was silent now, listening. Even the cars passing by seemed quieter. The second officer tried to speak. "We didn't mean to—" "Stop," the supervisor interrupted. His voice was sharp. "Not another word. You've said enough." The officer closed his mouth quickly. The man folded his arms across his chest. "I've dealt with criminals who treat people better than the way you treated me," he said softly. "And that's the truth." The supervisor didn't try to argue. He nodded slowly, understanding exactly what that meant. The flashing lights from the patrol car were still going, casting red and blue streaks across the street. The trees, the buildings, and the faces of everyone watching. The scene looked dramatic from the outside, but to the man it was just another example of something that happened too often. He wasn't just thinking about himself anymore. He was thinking about every person who couldn't pull out a badge to make people take them seriously. The supervisor finally told the officers to stand aside. They obeyed quickly like schoolchildren caught cheating on a test. "Sir," the supervisor said to the man, "do you need anything else from us right now?" "No," the man said quietly. "I'll handle the report tomorrow." "Understood," the supervisor replied. The crowd slowly started to break apart. Some people walked away quietly. Others stayed a little longer, whispering to each other. The man noticed a young boy still standing on the corner, wide-eyed, holding his phone tightly. He wasn't filming anymore, he was just watching. The man gave him a small nod, and the boy nodded back. The officers still stood to the side, silent. Their earlier confidence was gone. Their shoulders were no longer straight. It was clear they understood exactly how big of a mistake they had made. The man opened the door of his car but didn't get in right away. He turned back to the supervisor. "I don't need an apology to forget this," he said. "I need to know it won't keep happening to someone else." The supervisor nodded again. "I'll make sure of it," he said quietly. For the first time since he arrived, the supervisor's voice wasn't just professional, it was personal. He meant it. He understood the weight of the moment. The man gave one last glance at the two officers. Neither of them could hold his gaze. They looked down at the ground like it might swallow them. One of them finally whispered, "I'm sorry." The man didn't say anything in return. Sometimes silence was more powerful than any response. He got into his car, closed the door gently, and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel. He could still feel the tightness in his chest, the quiet anger buried beneath his calm. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was a steady burn that came from knowing this wasn't new. He started the engine, the sound smooth and steady. As he pulled away, the flashing lights behind him grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. The crowd was dispersing. The officers were still standing there, and their supervisor was already talking to them with a stern, controlled tone. The man took a slow breath. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He thought about every stop like this he'd seen, the ones he'd heard about and the ones no one ever talked about. This time he had power, but too many others didn't. That thought sat heavy in his chest. The drive home was quiet. The city lights passed by in soft streaks, and his reflection in the windshield was calm but thoughtful. He wasn't the kind of person to make a big scene or seek attention, but he also wasn't the kind to let things slide. The report would be written. The incident would be recorded. And more importantly, it would not be forgotten. Somewhere back on that street, two officers had just learned a lesson they wouldn't be able to ignore. And as the night grew darker, the man reminded himself of something he had always known deep down. Real strength isn't in how loud someone speaks. It's in how they carry themselves when everything is on the line. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel just slightly and kept driving, his mind already clear on what needed to be done next. This night would not end the way those officers had imagined when they pulled him over. It would end with truth. It would end with consequences. And maybe, just maybe, it would end with change. The two officers stood stiff, their earlier confidence slipping away like sand through fingers. A moment ago, they had spoken with such boldness, treating the man like he was just another driver they could push around. But now, after seeing the badge and realizing who they had just searched, their tone had changed completely. It was no longer sharp. It was shaky. The air itself felt different. The man calmly reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his identification card, and held it up at chest level, making sure they could see it clearly. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than any shout could. One of the officers swallowed hard. The other blinked fast, as if trying to find a way to fix what had already gone too far. He took a small step forward and said, "Sir, we didn't know." His voice cracked slightly. The man didn't respond right away. He simply held their gaze, still calm, but his eyes carried something they couldn't ignore. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet power of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The crowd watching from the sidewalk had grown bigger. People whispered to each other, trying to understand what was happening. The earlier tense energy had shifted. It was now the officers who were uncomfortable, not the man. Finally, he spoke. His words were clear, steady, and sharp enough to make both officers flinch. "You've had plenty of chances to listen," he said. "You chose not to." He took one slow step closer, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made them straighten their backs. "Now," he continued, "you're going to answer my questions." The officer holding his flashlight lowered it quickly. "Yes, sir," he said without hesitation. The man tilted his head slightly, keeping his voice calm. "Badge numbers, names, now." The officer hesitated for just a second too long, then quickly gave his badge number out loud. The second officer followed, his words stumbling over each other. The man repeated both numbers slowly, making sure he remembered them. His voice carried a quiet authority that made it impossible for them to look anywhere else. The supervisor's car arrived at that very moment, its headlights sweeping across the scene. A tall figure stepped out quickly, adjusting their belt and walking toward the group with a firm stride. The crowd fell silent for a moment, sensing something big was about to happen. The supervisor walked up to the officers first, not the man. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked, voice low but firm. Neither of the two officers answered. They looked at each other, then down at the ground. That silence said everything. The man lifted his badge again and held it out so the supervisor could see. The supervisor leaned forward, squinting for only a second before straightening up fast. Their entire posture changed. Shoulders pulled back, jaw clenched. "Sir," the supervisor said quickly, "I apologize for any inconvenience. If I had known," the man interrupted softly. "If you had known who I was?" He let the question hang in the air. "Or if you had known I wasn't just another person you could disrespect?" The supervisor opened their mouth, but no words came out. The man lowered the badge. "Your officers didn't just stop me. They made assumptions. They ignored my ID, they mocked me, and now you're standing here trying to explain what they should have done from the beginning." One of the officers shifted nervously. The other kept staring at the ground. The weight of every word fell on them like heavy stones. "I suggest you stop talking," the man added, "and start listening." The supervisor nodded slowly. The man took a deep breath, not to calm himself, but to give them one last chance to realize how serious the situation was. "I have the right to be treated with respect," he said. "That right does not depend on the color of my skin. It doesn't depend on my badge either. Every person you stop deserves the same respect I do. You just forgot that today," someone in the crowd whispered. "He's FBI." The whisper spread like a spark in dry grass. A ripple of quiet shock passed through the people watching. They weren't just witnessing a traffic stop anymore. They were witnessing accountability unfold right in front of them. The supervisor's face was pale now. They turned toward the officers and said in a firm tone, "Get your reports ready. Immediately." The man raised a hand slightly. "No," he said. "We're not rushing this." He stepped a little closer to the supervisor. "You'll document every word of what happened here, and I'll make sure the right people see it." The supervisor nodded again, slower this time. "Yes, sir." The man didn't look satisfied, but he didn't need to yell. His control over the situation was complete without ever raising his voice. The two officers, who had seemed so bold earlier, now looked like people standing at the edge of a storm they had created themselves. Their faces were tight with worry. The man could see it, and he didn't enjoy it, but he also didn't look away. "Let me make something clear," he said softly. "I could end your careers right here, right now. But that's not what matters to me. What matters is that you understand why this happened. What matters is that you remember this moment the next time you decide to treat someone differently, just because they don't look the way you expect them to." One of the officers lifted his head slowly. His eyes filled with regret. The other was too nervous to look up at all. The man let the silence stretch. He wanted the weight of it to stay with them. A few seconds later, the supervisor stepped forward. "Sir, we'll handle this properly," they said carefully. The man nodded once. "I know you will." "Because I'll be watching," the crowd murmured softly. Some people were filming quietly with their phones, capturing everything. Others just stood still, watching the way power had shifted in just a few minutes. The man who had been stopped like a suspect was now standing in full control, and the officers who had tried to intimidate him were the ones being questioned. The man turned to the first officer. "When I showed you my ID the first time," he said slowly, "you didn't even look at it. Why?" The officer's mouth opened, then closed again. He didn't have a real answer. His silence said more than words could. "You saw a man," the agent continued, "and you made a decision about him before you even spoke. You saw what you wanted to see. That's the problem. The second officer finally whispered. We made a mistake, sir. The man looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. You did. But not just one. The supervisor cleared their throat gently. Sir, may I suggest we move this conversation to the station? It'll be documented properly. The man shook his head. No, we'll do it right here. In the open. Because what happened here should be seen. The supervisor didn't argue. He pulled out his phone, not to record but to send a quick message. Within moments, a black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner and parked behind his car. The crowd whispered again, curious about what was happening. Two plain-clothed individuals stepped out of the SUV. They didn't need introductions. Their calm but firm posture said everything about who they were. They walked straight to the man, exchanged a quick nod with him, and then turned their attention to the officers. The supervisor stepped back slightly, realizing this situation had grown much bigger than they'd expected. The man crossed his arms and said softly, I hope you understand what this means. I hope you think about this the next time you step out of your car and approach someone who looks like me. One of the officers whispered, Yes, sir, almost under his breath. The man didn't smile. He didn't feel victorious. What he felt was the weight of years of moments like this, moments where people made the wrong assumptions. But this time it hadn't gone the way the officers expected. This time the story was different. He took a step back and looked at the crowd. Some people nodded at him with quiet respect. Others just watched silently, their eyes wide. The supervisor finally said, Sir, everything will be documented as per protocol. There will be an internal review. I assure you, the man cut in softly. You don't need to assure me. I know how this works. He handed the supervisor a small card with a number on it. You'll hear from my office, he said. The supervisor took the card carefully like it weighed 100 pounds. The man gave one last look at the two officers. This moment will follow you, he said quietly. Make sure the next one looks different. Then he turned away, walking back toward his car with the same calm energy he had carried from the very beginning. The crowd parted slightly as he passed, their eyes following him. He got into the car slowly, shut the door, and rested his hands on the steering wheel for a brief second before starting the engine. Behind him, the officers stood still, their faces pale, their minds racing. The supervisor spoke to them in a low voice, but the words didn't matter now. What mattered was what they had seen in his eyes, the calm strength of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. As he drove away, the flashing lights faded behind him. But the weight of that moment stayed with everyone who had witnessed it. The officers, the crowd, the supervisor, and most of all the man who had just turned their assumptions upside down.